If you look in the dictionary for the greatest, sleaziest, notorious rock and roll club ever, you will see a picture of Cathouse. Not true. The truth is, if you look in the Britannica dictionary under the word Cathouse, there's one sentence: a place where prostitutes are available. The Cathouse we talk about on this podcast is my Cathouse. I'm Riki Rachtman, former host of Headbangers Ball and the proprietor of what was a truly legendary rock club, where the biggest bands in the world would play secret shows. But what truly made the Cathouse world famous was what went on off the stage. In this episode, we're going to go back further than we did in episode 1. Today, I'll tell a little bit of my story and how punk rock led me to a career in metal, what band brought me to the dark side, and what led to the creation of the Cathouse. Today, you'll hear from an old high school buddy who, with myself, promoted our first show at the Starwood. His name is Keith Cooper. And we're going to take you to the Starwood, which was a place where punk band the Germs played their last show and Motley Crue played their first. I'll tell you about the crossroads where I went into the metal scene, created the club, and my best friend at the time stayed in the punk scene to create a clothing brand called Lip Service. How does Randy Rhoads' Dogtown dance music fit into the story? Well, if I ever did write a book, the first few chapters would sound like this. So come with me inside the Cathouse. No, sorry, you can't bring your camera or phone with you inside. We don't want anybody to know what's going on. I'll tell you, because we're going to go way back. And it all happens inside episode 2 of the Cathouse Hollywood Podcast. Coming to you from the Cathouse South Studio in Race City, USA. This is episode 2 of the Cathouse Hollywood Podcast, which is powered by Cathouse Coffee, a true coffee company owned and operated by myself and Leah Vendetta. Craft roasted in small batches. We're there for the roasting, the packaging, and shipping. And our dark roast blend is simply the best coffee, period. Try it at cathousecoffee.com. And if you use the code CAT2, once again, that discount code is CAT2. You'll get 10% off your order. That's cathousecoffee.com. I grew up in Van Nuys, California. I went to Irwin Street Elementary School, Milliken Junior High School, and Grant High School. At one point during high school, it was decided that it might be better for me to live with my father rather than stay with my mother. So I ended up in the Hollywood Hills. I probably could have gone to Hollywood High, but I decided to stay at Grant. To get to high school, I had a badass yellow Motorbicane moped. That thing could hit 40 miles an hour, and mopeds weren't supposed to go over 35. It was the closest thing I had to a motorcycle, and I thought that it was really cool until I got to an intersection, and to get it going, you had to pedal really, really, really fast. The moped was even slower when I had someone on the back, and when I rode to school, I had someone on the back. Drew Bernstein, like myself, was a skateboarder. Well, Drew was much better than I was. Back then, we were all enamored by the Dogtown scene of Santa Monica and Venice. So you'd have a nickname with dog at the end. Drew's nickname was Spoo Dog. I was Zap Dog. Don't ask me why. I'm not really sure. Drew also lived in the Hollywood Hills, but went to high school at Grant. We both started getting into punk rock at about the same time, 1979, just as it was starting to hit LA. And there were some great bands. Back then, if you said punk rock, people would yell Devo or even the B-52s. But the truth is, there was really good music then. I remember when Drew and I decided we were going to go see our first punk rock show, which was at UCLA, and the band was the Ramones. At high school, Drew and I were misfits. And even though we were the youngest kids at this Ramones show, we felt like we fit in. We decided that night we were going to be punk rockers. Only a few days after the Ramones show, we wanted to go to our first real punk rock show. Remember, this is 1979. We didn't drive. We had to find people to give us a ride or take the bus. Few venues would allow this new punk rock fad at their clubs. The crowds usually weren't that big, and usually stuff would get pretty thrashed. In downtown Los Angeles, you had Chinatown, which was not like the Chinatown of today or the Chinatown in San Francisco or Chicago. It was kind of a ghost town and not too safe, but there were two venues that allowed punk rock shows, Madame Wong's and the Hong Kong Cafe. Halloween, 1979, Drew and I were going to the Hong Kong Cafe. When I was a teenager, I was not the manly man you all know. I was a little baby face, and no matter how badass I thought I was not frail, but just not a badass. At the Hong Kong Cafe on Halloween, the first band that night was Chinas Comidas. Back then, you didn't say the word mosh. The pit was filled at the time with slam dancing, which is the same thing, I guess, as moshing, just not as many lunkheads standing outside the circle looking for a fight. It was early, so I could get in, get shoved around a bit, then get out. Next band, Black Flag. This was early Black Flag. The singer wore a Spider-Man costume the whole time. After all, it was Halloween. Under that mask was Black Flag's first singer, Keith Morris, who ended up leaving the band and started his own band, the Circle Jerks. The next band was the Germs. I wasn't really familiar with the Germs. They had a chick bass player. I'm a young kid, so I thought she was cool. Their drummer was Don Bowles and guitarist Pat Smear, who later joined Nirvana and is currently in the Foo Fighters. Out stumbles their singer, jet black, spiky hair. This also marks the first time I saw a musician really fucked up on stage. The music was sloppy but catchy, and the singer, well, sometimes he would yell in the mic and moan and sound like a cat in heat with a few growls thrown in there. I had no idea what he was singing about, couldn't understand a word. His name was Darby Crash. His singing didn't really match the tempo of the song, and I thought to myself, damn, this is pretty awful. I do have to admit, though, throughout the tumbling, stumbling, and pacing on stage, Darby Crash had swagger. The next band on was Fear. The crowd went nuts. I remember a lot of slam dancing and a lot of spitting on the band. Everybody was getting thrown around, and it was a good time. The songs were not only loud and fast and violent, they were kind of funny. Sure, you had significant lyrics like, "Let's have a war so you can go die," but they also had a love song which told the tale of a woman enamored with her man's sexual prowess. The lyrics stated so. She don't want a chicken, she don't want a roast. She just wants her double dose of my beef, 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 beef bologna. Fear was fantastic. And who would have thought in 1993 I would go into the studio to do background vocals on Guns N' Roses' version of the Fear song, "I Don't Care About You," which appears on The Spaghetti Incident. During the weekends then, I would work at the Marina Del Rey skate park. This is where Tony Alva and Jay Adams and Dwayne Peters and Polar Bear and all the coolest skaters called home. I worked the snack bar. My meal was nacho cheese Doritos and Aspen, which was an apple-flavored soda back in the day. I remember when they brought in the video game Asteroids. For those of you that don't remember that game, you had this little white triangle. No, not 3D. It was pretty much a little white triangle. And you would shoot very one-dimensional shapes that were supposed to be asteroids. Occasionally, a flying saucer would go by, which was little more than a couple white lines. It was very basic, very antiquated, and the biggest video game of that time. Working at Marina Del Rey Skate Park was a great job for me because I loved skateboarding. And at this point, I was really into the local Los Angeles or Orange County punk rock scene. The skateboarding culture really seemed to champion punk rock. It's funny, if I made a list of the bands I listened to in high school, those bands would be included in the list of bands I still listen to today. Black Flag, The Adolescents. I still know every word of that Blue album. Bad Religion. I was actually listening to Bad Religion today, and damn, that's a great band. I can't wait to see them live soon. Let me talk about TSOL. Dance With Me. That was my go-to album. That was the album that I'd listen to by TSOL when your parents are mad at you, you run in the room and you slam the door and you put on the headphones. It was TSOL's Dance With Me. And of course, I listened to the Germs. I would listen to the Germs, sit down on the floor, pull out the album, and look at that album sleeve. I would read the lyrics. I'd try to decipher Darby's highly sophisticated vocabulary, all really intelligent pieces of work. His live shows were raw, unpredictable, sometimes catastrophic, but it didn't matter. Darby became an acquaintance of mine, which to me was really cool. He was kind of the first rock star I had ever met. Yeah, I met Alice Cooper as a kid, but that was through my father. Punk rock was mine. I remember one time going over to Darby's apartment near Highland on Hollywood. It was the first time I saw someone shoot up heroin. It kind of freaked me out. I had my sister with me, who must have been around 16. This woman at Darby's was talking to my sister a lot. My sister said she felt a little intimidated. Turns out that woman ended up producing the Germs' first album. It was Joan Jett. Whenever there was a show, Drew and I would go. I started making friends in the punk rock scene. There was a few punk rock shows at places like The Mask or the Fleetwood, Hope Street Ballroom. But at this point, you wouldn't get to see most of these bands at the more popular clubs like the Whiskey Roxy or Troubadour. And on the rare occasion one of them did play, we were too young to get in. I also became friends with a Huntington Beach punk with blue hair named Rob Henley. A lot of people didn't like him much, and I never was sure why. There was a movie about the Germs, and Rob Henley was portrayed as Darby's lover. Look, I don't know too much about that, but all I know is that women really loved Rob Henley. Punk rock continued to grow in Los Angeles about the same time a wave of Hollywood metal bands were getting signed. Soon, punk shows were popping up at the popular Sunset Strip clubs, but never would you get the two genres on the same night. Metal and punk, they didn't match together. On Santa Monica Boulevard, there was a club called the Starwood. It was on Santa Monica and Crescent Heights. The Starwood ranked up there with the Whiskey, Roxy, and Gazzarri's as far as the important rock clubs of Los Angeles. Rat, Motley Crue, Van Halen, The Runaways, Cheap Trick, they all played the Starwood. The club was big too, with a lot of different rooms. Tuesday and Wednesday was New Wave Night. You'd get a couple of punk bands, great bands. It might be X, it could even be Gang of Four. Then you would get Rodney Bingenheimer of Rodney on the Rock fame DJing in one of the other rooms that had a dance floor. I know I wasn't near old enough to drink, but I still found a way to get into some trouble. One night in particular, I remember this girl named Gerber that was sort of the girlfriend of Rob Henley giving me a handful of drugs. I was a dumb kid. I took the drugs. I had borrowed my parents' Ford Fiesta at the time. Rob Henley was going to stay with me at my mother's house. I attempted to drive home, passed out, hit a parked car, and threw Rob through the windshield. Nobody wore seatbelts back then. His face was covered in blood. I only lived down the street, so my parents came there just as the ambulance had taken us to the hospital. We were both okay. Rob had some minor lacerations on his face. He had to stay with me at my mother's house for a few days. Rob had spoken to his mother from the hospital, told her that he was okay, and she had told him that she would come visit. My mother tells me the story about how excited Rob was that his mother was actually coming to visit him. She never showed. Rob was very close to Darby during the accident. At that time, Darby had been over in London. When Darby got back, we had made plans for Drew, Darby, and myself to go to the Universal Studios tour. Okay, I have no idea how this whole thing came up, but the three of us went to Universal. Darby had shown up with this really high, thin mohawk. He told us of this band he saw play in the UK that was mind-blowing. Best stage show ever. That band was called Adam and the Ants. I know one time my high school had a screening of Pee-wee's Big Adventure, and Darby went with me, but I don't really remember hanging out after that. Darby Crash eventually went solo, but it never was the same as the Germs. Punk rock had exploded and become popular, trendy, and hip. December 7th, 1980, Darby died of an intentional heroin overdose. The next day, John Lennon was murdered, so Darby's death wasn't publicized. Drew and I were still going to shows, but not as much. He'd give me a hard time because I started dating this girl that went to my high school named Linda. I was a punk. Linda liked disco. Yeah, it doesn't make sense, and believe me, it really didn't. She was my first, by the way. All the people around my high school were talking about this band, Quiet Riot. They were heavy metal. I was a punk. So it was probably suggested by Linda that we go to the Starwood to see the most popular band in our area. All I remember was they had a song I kind of liked called Sleek Black Cadillac. And their guitarist, who was pretty much the first local glam musician I remember seeing live, he was pretty damn good. His name was Randy Rhoads. And people weren't really talking about Kevin Dubrow, the singer of Quiet Riot. Nope, everybody liked Randy Rhoads. I can't say I was really into the whole scene, but there were a lot of girls there. Through the years, Drew and I started to drift apart. I started checking out a few underground rock bands, and he would give me shit about that too. We'd still hang out, just not as much as before. He started silkscreening shirts and then leggings out of his parents' garage. Eventually, he started selling these printed leggings, and within a few short years, he started the company Lip Service. Lip Service got huge. I wore Lip Service on Headbangers Ball, but so did most of the bands. Those prints with the daggers all over them, they were really popular. That was Lip Service. He also started another brand called Kill City. It was always cool when our paths crossed in the rock world, knowing where we both came from. Drew would come to the Cathouse, and it was like walking into a showroom. Everybody there had Lip Service clothes on, both men and women. Just like the scene slowed down, so did his company. I don't know how it was doing financially, but Drew must have been hurting. August 18th, 2014, Drew died of a self-inflicted gunshot. Let's go back to high school now, because there's another person that comes into play, and his name is Keith Cooper. So I'm in high school. My only real friend is Drew, because we're the two punk rockers in the school. But Drew knows this guy at school named Keith Cooper. Keith had a nice Mustang. He lived in a nice house. He was kind of popular, kind of a jock. He was nothing like me, but he and Drew knew each other since they were kids. One day I see Keith Cooper at my school, and he's wearing a t-shirt that says Flash Cadillac. Flash Cadillac and the Continental Kids was a rude, crude band that would do 50 songs. They also appeared on the TV show Happy Days and the movie American Graffiti. Flash Cadillac's manager was my father. I asked Keith where he got the shirt, and he told me his father was the band's attorney. Okay, that was the total conversation we had for the year. By pure coincidence, we sat at the same table as each other at our high school prom. We never said a word, but I remember that night because Keith State passed out, face down, in her soup. No, really, it happened. Eventually, Keith would start dating Debbie, who was the younger sister of the girl Linda that I was dating. So I guess our paths crossed a few more times. Eventually, we became good friends. I didn't give up on punk rock, but I was starting to go to a few rockabilly shows and maybe even an underground rock show here or there. I always loved music, but I appreciated all kinds of music. I still do to this day. Okay, once again, as is the case with many Cathouse stories, things get a little blurry, so I had to bring in Keith into this story. On Riverside Drive in Toluca Lake, there was a video arcade. For some reason, Keith and I hung out there a lot, probably playing Centipede or something.
It was after high school, but we were hanging around this arcade in Toluca Lake. I think it was owned by this guy named Barron, maybe his brother. But they had a band, and the band was called Triangle. Anyway, at that time, they had, for whatever reason, asked Riki if he would promote. But also in this time, Riki wasn't exactly the most social person. I think this was in the height of his punk rock era, and was somewhat of an antisocial guy at the time. But I was kind of the opposite. All I did was socialize and was always looking for a party. And so he asked me if I would help him promote it or promote it with them. I said, sure. And we started a little company called Outcrowd Productions.
I was not part of the in crowd. I didn't know the people in the scene that went to the in clubs. Keith did. Well, okay, the in clubs, I should say, that allowed minors to get in. We weren't even old enough to drink. So what would the opposite of the in crowd be? I came up with the concept of The Outcrowd, thus Outcrowd Productions. The name Outcrowd Productions sounds really good, but it was really just me and Keith. I had no idea what I was talking about when I agreed to promote the show, but I've always been pretty good at convincing people I do know what I'm talking about, even when I don't. So these guys that owned the arcade wanted to promote their rock band, Triangle. These guys were long-haired rockers. They also had money, so they were able to help with some of the expenses. Remember that club I told you about, the Starwood? In its heyday, it featured big names in metal and in punk. A matter of fact, there was a guy that worked at the Starwood that one day convinced his boss to let his band play. It was April 24th, 1981. That guy was Nikki Sixx, and that was Motley Crue's very first show. I saw punk bands play there, and I saw a couple rock bands play there. But late in 1981, all I saw there was a for rent sign.
The club had already been closed for, several months. And, they had problems with the neighborhood and had been trying to shut them down for years. But it was available for private parties. So what we had to do is we couldn't sell tickets at the door.
Okay, I find out I can rent the Starwood, but it has to be a private party. That means we can't charge to get in. Oh, there's one minor thing Keith left out. It was more than a few neighbors complaining that had the club shut down. About that same time, there was an event in Hollywood that became known as the Wonderland Murders. 4 brutal murders that occurred in Los Angeles. Story is, this house in Laurel Canyon housed 5 people that were targeted to be killed. LAPD detectives said the crime scene was more bloody and gruesome than the Tate LaBianca murders. Porn star John Holmes was arrested, tried, and acquitted for his involvement. Who was this horrific crime mastermind that had these people killed? His name was Eddie Nash. Eddie Nash owned the Starwood. Yeah, it was at times a little sketchy when we were there. There was also no liquor license, couldn't sell anything, and we couldn't charge admission at the door. But hey, this band Triangle is paying the expenses and telling us they've got a huge fan base, so what the hell? I decided to have a friend draw a little flyer that we printed on Dayglow pieces of paper. Keith and I would go everywhere and pass out these flyers. It said, Outcrowd Productions on it. We present dancing and the band Triangle. It also noted that only advance tickets would be sold. And to get the tickets, you had to call a phone number. This was before cell phones. The number on the flyer was my house that I lived at with my parents. The phone would ring. My mom would pick it up. Ricky, someone on the phone wants to buy tickets. I'd pick up the phone. They would tell me where they live. And obviously we didn't take credit cards, so we would go on their word, drive to their house, and hand deliver the tickets.
Well, I remember Ricky and I driving around literally all over the city of Los Angeles. I mean, from Santa Monica to Pasadena to Woodland Hills, selling individual tickets at $5 a piece. I mean, sometimes we'd sell 2, 4. I guess if we were really lucky, we'd sell 6 at any one time. But we literally drove all over the entire city of Los Angeles to try to sell these tickets.
Somehow we sold a few of these tickets. So we got the band, we sold a few tickets. Okay, we needed a DJ. We didn't know any DJs. There was no equipment, so this is what we would do. We'd go to my parents' house and tape songs off the radio, then hit pause, then play a song from a record player, hit pause, then another song from the radio, and it kept on going on and on and on. And it took hours, it took days. We'd always hit pause before the DJ would speak. Crazy, right? Somehow it sort of worked. We just wanted to fill the space between when the band Triangle played. We thought that they were okay, and they told us that they had a big following, so we knew it was going to be a successful night. And here we are, our first night as club promoters.
The night of the event was absolutely amazing. I mean, this place was packed. We probably had, seem to recall 800 people or more showing up to the club, and the place was entirely sold out. Ricky popped the mixtape in, and I mean, the dance floor was packed, and the energy was off the charts in the place, and it was super exciting, and we were in the best mood, and everybody was in the best mood, and we were really excited and enthusiastic to jump on stage and introduce the band.
This was also the first time I was on stage with a microphone in front of a lot of people. Keith and I had achieved success. Remember, I had never been accepted by this crowd. After all, I was more into punk rock, not the trendy social clubs. And now Keith Cooper and I are on the stage. I grabbed the mic. Ladies and gentlemen, Outcrowd Production presents Triangle. 3 guys with long hair take the stage. Big amps, big guitar, and they hit that first power chord.
Literally within about 2 minutes, there was like 1,000 people crawling all over themselves to escape the place. I mean, it literally emptied out in what seemed like seconds. But I remember after that, we went outside and we were trying to convince people to stay. But by that time, the police had pretty much shut down Santa Monica Boulevard, were demanding everybody to leave. And I think it was shortly after that the club shut its doors permanently.
So the first night as a promoter did not turn out well. We learned a few things, though. 1, nobody liked Triangle. And 2, that meant we were the ones that brought the people to the Starwood that night. In the following months, Keith and I would rent out, of all places, a gym. We turned one of the racquetball courts into a dance floor and hired a DJ named Lee Selwyn. We had our Christmas in July party. Lee was a great DJ. He'd play a lot of the cool clubs, the more underground scene, and many times I'd help carry big crates of records for Lee in exchange of him teaching me how to DJ. Soon, I started getting gigs at clubs myself. I worked on my technique as a DJ. I concentrated more on mixing and scratching, and also, God, I hate saying this, but I worked on perfecting my craft. But I really was damn good. I started making a little money doing it. I was 21 now, and my alcohol intake increased dramatically. When I was working at a club, the drinks were free. I still listened to punk rock, and I was really into rockabilly at that time as well. You know, a lot of people went from punk rock to rockabilly. It wasn't really that unheard of. Pretty soon, I was that rockabilly haircut guy at the dance clubs. I even had my first tattoo around then. Now I'm going to skip ahead a few years to being at Keith's parents' house. Keith's parents had money. That meant they had cable. That meant they had MTV. And one day I happened to glance over at a video that blew me away. It was a band I had heard of because they were playing the LA scene. They had tight black and red leather on. There was fire. It was evil. And the coolest thing I had seen in a long time. It was the Motley Crue Live Wire video. I don't know if that was such a turning point for me, but I know that as a punk rockabilly guy that played dance music for a living, I was pretty impressed. And I thought, man, that shit was cool. Okay, we're going to hit a turning point right here when metal comes into play. And let me clarify something. This was not when I first started listening to rock. I was always into hard rock. I slept in a parking lot to see Ted Nugent when I was 14. I saw Aerosmith play, and their opening act was this band from Australia called AC/DC. Yeah, I saw them with Bon Scott. I saw Queen, and Thin Lizzy opened up for him. Okay, my dad had to take me to that show, but I remember it. I was also a full-blown, hardcore, off-the-wall, Alice Cooper fanatic. Jimi Hendrix, ELP, ELO. I loved Motorhead, but I always loved Motorhead. I didn't look at them as a metal band. I liked Motorhead in my punk days, and most punk rockers did too. I also had a couple Van Halen albums because even though they weren't very punk, those first Van Halen albums, they were just damn good, and everybody knew that. To me, it felt like there was a little punk rock attitude in it. I started getting more and more exposed to some of the bands that were making it in the LA club scene. I remember Rats Round and Round going to number 1. I got into bands like The Alarm, which were a little rock and a little bit of everything. I saw The Alarm at the Hollywood Palladium. I got really drunk and got beat up by security guards. Good times. I started buying more and more rock records, but still going to some punk shows. I remember seeing this band, The Joneses, play. and they had this opening act that really changed my life. They had long hair, makeup, messy makeup, sort of New York Dolls-ish. These guys were dangerous too, and rock and roll is supposed to be dangerous, right? They were called Guns N' Roses. There were a lot of bands from the mid-'80s scene that came from the punk rock scene. Hell, Steve Jones from the Sex Pistols put out a rock record. 1983, my hair was getting longer. I was still playing records in the dance clubs, but I was also listening to a lot more metal when I wasn't a DJ. Motley Crue's Shout of the Devil was released, and I remember looking at that pentagram. Oh, this is so evil. There was a warning on that record that it included backward lyrics. Someone once told me it said, "Jesus is Satan." Holy fuck. This is dark. I remember slowly putting the needle on the vinyl and hearing those words.
In the beginning, good always overpowered the evils of all men's sins. But in time the nations grew weak, and our cities fell to slums. While evil stood strong, in the depths of hell lurked the blackest of hates.
Oh my God, I'm going to hell just for listening to this. Then that guitar kicked in to shout at the devil. I held a black album cover with a big black pentagram on it, hearing sounds that had to be calling Lucifer himself up from the embers through my speakers and into my soul. The last song on side one was Helter Skelter. Yeah, it was a Beatles song, but we all knew it was a phrase used by the terrifying murderous cult, the Manson family. Oh yeah, this is so wrong. 1983 to 84, I'm listening to a lot more hard rock, and so is everyone. Now I'm the guy in the DJ booth at some of the biggest dance clubs that looked a little bit out of place. I was a rocker playing dance music. I was turning some of my DJ friends into metal fans too. Okay, only one really comes to mind. Remember earlier I told you how Keith and I hired this guy, Lee Selwyn, to DJ one of our parties? Well, Lee would teach me to spin records, turn me on to new bands before anyone caught wind of them. Lee would also play some cool parties, the kind of parties that I'd never get invited to. But if I carried record crates, I could go with Lee to the parties. And by the way, to all you DJs that carry a laptop and a USB, you don't know how easy you have it. We used to carry 3 or 4 big, heavy milk crates that you had to steal, by the way. You could only carry one at a time, and you'd bring it to your car, which really sucked when it was raining. Most DJs at the time had arms that were 3 or 4 inches longer than normal humans. So even when I wasn't playing records, I'd help carry crates of records to parties with Lee. I told Lee about Motley Crue and how we needed to go to the concert when it came to town. He agreed. I went to a costume store and I bought these tight black and white striped pants. Okay, maybe they were more like tights. I don't remember. I know Lee and I got really loaded in the parking lot before the show, and when I had to go to the bathroom, I couldn't get the pants off. I pissed all over myself. Good times. Lee had a friend that I would run into now and then named Brett. Good guy. Turns out Brett's full name was Brett Easton Ellis. He wrote Less Than Zero, and from what I heard, some of the characters in the book were based on Lee. Brett also had success with a novel called American Psycho. I hadn't promoted a club for a year or so, and never had I thought about doing a weekly bar, meaning promoting a club one night a week. Now, there were clubs that would be rented out by a certain promoter one night a week, and these promoters were making money. I was kind of itching to promote something again. Yeah, I love my metal and punk, but I wanted to try something different, and on a small scale at first. Even though I was making a little bit of money playing records in clubs, I still wanted to be more than a DJ. I'm driving down Pacific Coast Highway in Malibu, and right on the coast there was this fairly rundown hotel with a nightclub attached to it called the Sunspot. I set up a meeting with the owner, and once again, using my bachelor's degree in bullshit, convinced him I should be the entertainment director and be able to rent out this club for a weekly event. I told him I was the biggest dance club DJ in LA. I ended up getting the gig, not only helping to promote the club, but as a DJ a few days a week. This place, even though it was in Malibu, was pretty run down. I remember being a DJ. I was playing a song by Prince that was on purple vinyl, and while the record was spinning, a rat ran across the turntable and into a hole in the DJ booth. There was this one guy that was a Sunspot local. He would show up a couple times a week, even if the club was dead, and he'd hang out with me in the DJ booth. His name was Morris Day. Yeah, Morris Day of the band The Time. Morris Day from the Purple Rain movie. You never expected him in the story, did you? Fact is, Morris was cool as hell. And when the movie Purple Rain was released, he even invited me to the after party. I had a pretty good run at the Sunspot, but eventually that also took its toll. And I don't know if it was health code violations or the property was sold, but the Sunspot eventually disappeared. I was still doing okay financially because I still had my DJ gigs with various promoters. One of the promoters I worked for was a guy named John Dunn. I worked a few nights a week for John at various clubs. John and I did a lot of cocaine, which usually ended with a yellow pad of paper writing up these great ideas for restaurants and screenplays and countless other mindless concepts that never came to fruition. At some point, we decided we would do a nightclub together and call it Ice. Ice would be located at the Probe nightclub, which was at 836 North Highland in West Hollywood. This is about the time that I met Tammy. This is the club that will eventually become the second and most known home for the Cathouse. Ice was very successful, but a very successful trendy dance club usually meant you were hot for maybe 11 months. It was 1984, maybe 1985, and by this time when I wasn't playing clubs, I was going to rock shows. I decided I wanted to be a singer in a rock band. Deep down inside, through all of this, I have always wanted to be a singer in a band. Back then, there was a local paper called The Recycler. The Recycler had classified ads, and many times musicians could find other musicians to start bands with. This is how a lot of bands got their start. The following ads were actually placed in The Recycler. Bass player needed for band influenced by Aerosmith, Alice Cooper. Call Slash. Duff answered that ad. Drummer looking for other metal musicians to jam with. Tigers of Pantang, Diamond Head, and Iron Maiden. Do you know who placed that ad? Lars. And only 2 people answered, but one of them was James Hetfield. When Motley Crue was forming, Nicky and Tommy answered an ad that read, "Loud, rude, and aggressive guitarist available." That guitarist was Mick Mars. I answered an ad to an audition for a local band that had a little success. The band was called Candy. Their singer had left the band, and currently their guitarist was singing. When I went to audition, that guitarist wasn't there. I went to a stinky rehearsal studio, played a couple songs, but I didn't get the gig. They were fairly bubblegum, kind of in a good way. And I was a little more, I just sure wasn't very bubblegum. I ended up becoming good friends with a guitarist, and on occasion, he'd hang out with me while I DJ'd at Ice. His name, Ryan Roxy. Today, Ryan is the guitarist for Alice Cooper and has been for a while. That guitarist that was also the singer of Candy that wasn't there that day, that's Gilby Clarke, who eventually became one of the key figures in the Cathouse history. So at this point, I had my handful of rocker friends while I was still the DJ at Ice. Yeah, I know it's totally out of order, but if you go back and listen to episode 1, you'll hear how I met Tammy. And if it wasn't for Tammy, there wouldn't be a Cathouse, which meant I wouldn't have been on Headbangers Ball, and I would have nothing to talk about on this podcast. Before we wrap up, I want to peel back the curtains and show you that there's nobody really there. On our podcast, there isn't an editor, a producer, director, or writer, or somebody. It's just me. And the truth is, because we don't have advertising on this show, it cost me to make this podcast. I might have a Patreon in the future, but I don't now. So the way that you could really support this show is easy. So easy. Which, by the way, the It's So Easy video was filmed at the Cathouse. All you have to do is go to cathousehollywood.com and buy something. We've got Headbangers Ball stickers now. And, of course, Headbangers t-shirts, hoodies, long sleeve. The original Cathouse shirt. Don't buy that bootleg crap. They're a bunch of criminals, and they suck and sell you bad stuff. Buy the authentic Cathouse Hollywood merch at cathousehollywood.com. The website's brand new. Go there now. That's cathousehollywood.com. I had a good time. I hope you did too. I love reminiscing, if you will. And I know that some of you are waiting for those 80s rock stories. I promise you, they are coming up with a lot of people that were part of those stories. I'm just trying to paint the picture for you. Remember, if you like this podcast, subscribe, download, give it a great review, and tell your friends. And don't forget, I have another podcast called Riki Rachtman Radio. And the last couple episodes, pretty interesting because we talk about pornography. That's Riki Rachtman Radio. So we're at the Cathouse still, and the lights just came on. That means it's time for us to go. Wow, those lights are really bright, aren't they? Well, the drinks are done. We hear the clanking of bottles as the bartenders pick up the bottles, and we're hushed out the door. But don't worry, because you know we'll be back for episode 3 of the Cathouse Hollywood podcast. I'm Riki Rachtman. Remember to keep one foot in the gutter, one fist in the gold.